This is Process and Reality, the only officially unofficial guide to reading Alfred North Whitehead. I'm your host, Tyler Davis. Welcome to the show. Hey everybody, before we continue, I just want to let you know about Anchor, the platform that I'm using to create this podcast. If you enjoy the quality and the ease of access you get to this podcast, well, you need to try out Anchor because they distribute everything for you. It's super awesome. It's totally free. You can use it right from your phone or your computer. Their creation tools actually allow you to record and edit your podcast. So it sounds super great. They're going to distribute it on all the platforms, like I said, so you can hear it from Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and tons more places. And you get paid for the ads ultimately that you run, and there's no minimum listenership. So you should totally go download the Anchor app or go to anchor.fm, get yourself started, start your own podcast, start saying something important, get out there, and make it happen. All right, we've reached section 6. We're at episode 9. Join me in page 14. It has been an objection to speculative philosophy that it is over-ambitious. Rationalism, it is admitted, is the method by which advance is made within the limits of particular sciences. It is, however, held that this limited success must not encourage attempts to frame ambitious schemes expressive of the general nature of things. One alleged justification of this criticism is ill success. European thought is represented as littered with metaphysical systems, abandoned and unreconciled. Such an assertion tacitly fastens upon philosophy the old dogmatic test. The same criterion would fasten ill success upon science. We no more retain the physics of 17th century than we do Cartesian philosophy of that century. Yet within limits, both systems express important truths. Also, we're beginning to understand the wider categories which define their limits of correct application. Of course, in that century, dogmatic views held sway, so that the validity of both of the physical notions and of the Cartesian notions was misconceived. Mankind never quite knows what it's after. When we survey the history of thought and likewise the history of practice, we find that one idea after another is tried out, its limitations defined, and its core of truth elicited. In application to the instinct for the intellectual adventures demanded by particular epochs, there is much truth in Augustine's rhetorical phrase, securus judicat orbis terrarum. At the very least, men do what they can in the way of systematization, and in the event achieve something. The proper test is not that of finality, but of progress. But the main objection, dating from the 16th century and receiving final expression from Francis Bacon, is the uselessness of philosophic speculation. The position taken by this objection is that we ought to describe detailed matter of fact and elicit the laws with a generality strictly limited to the systematization of these described details. General interpretation, it is held, has no bearing upon this procedure, and thus any system of general interpretation, be it true or false, remains intrinsically barren. Unfortunately, for this objection, there are no brute self-contained matters of fact capable of being understood apart from interpretation as an element in a system. Whenever we attempt to express the matter of immediate experience, we find that its understanding leads us beyond itself, to its contemporaries, to its past, to its future, and to the universals in terms of which its definiteness is exhibited. But such universals, by their very character of universality, embody the potentiality of other facts with variant types of definiteness. Thus, the understanding of the immediate brute fact requires its metaphysical interpretation as an item in a world with some systematic relation to it. When thought comes upon the scene, it finds the interpretations as a matter of practice. Philosophy does not initiate interpretations. Its search for a rationalistic scheme is the search for more adequate criticism and for more adequate justification of the interpretations which we perforce employ. Our habitual experience is a complex of failure and success in the enterprise of interpretation. If we desire a record of uninterpreted experience, we must ask a stone to record its autobiography. Every scientific memoir in its record of the facts is shot through and through with interpretation. The methodology of rational interpretation is the product of the fitful vagueness of consciousness. Elements which shine with immediate distinctness in some circumstances retire into penumbral shadow in other circumstances, and into black darkness on other occasions. And yet all occasions proclaim themselves as actualities within the flux of a solid world, demanding a unity of interpretation. Philosophy is the self-correction by consciousness of its own initial excess of subjectivity. Each actual occasion contributes to the circumstances of its origin, additional formative elements, deepening its own peculiar individuality. Consciousness is only the last and greatest of such elements, by which the selective character of the individual obscures the external totality from which it originates and which it embodies. An actual individual of such higher grade has truck with the totality of things by reason of its sheer actuality. But it has attained its individual depth of being by a selective emphasis, limited to its own purposes. The task of philosophy is to recover the totality obscured by the selection. It replaces in rational experience what has been submerged in the higher sensitive experience and has been sunk yet deeper by the initial operations of consciousness itself. The selectiveness of individual experience is moral, so far as it conforms to the balance of importance disclosed in the rational vision. And conversely, the conversion of the intellectual insight into an emotional force corrects the sensitive experience in the direction of morality. The correction is in proportion to the rationality of the insight. Morality of outlook is inseparably conjoined with generality of outlook. The antithesis between the general good and the individual interest can be abolished only when the individual is such that its interest is the general good, thus exemplifying the loss of the minor intensities in order to find them again with finer composition in a wider sweep of interest. Philosophy frees itself from the taint of ineffectiveness by its close relations with religion and with science, natural and sociological. It attains its chief importance by fusing the two, namely religion and science, into one rational scheme of thought. Religion should connect the rational generality of philosophy with the emotions and purposes springing out of existence in a particular society, in a particular epoch, and conditioned by particular antecedents. Religion is the translation of general ideas into particular thoughts, particular emotions, and particular purposes. It is directed to the end of stretching individual interest beyond its self-defeating particularity. Philosophy finds religion and modifies it. And conversely, religion is among the data of experience, which philosophy must weave into its own scheme. Religion is an ultimate craving to infuse into the insistent particularity of emotion that non-temporal generality which primarily belongs to conceptual thought alone. In the higher organisms, the differences of tempo between the mere emotions and the conceptual experiences produce a life tedium unless this supreme fusion has been effected. The two sides of the organism require a reconciliation in which emotional experiences illustrate a conceptual justification and conceptual experiences find an emotional illustration. This demand for an intellectual justification of brute experience has also been the motive power in the advance of European science. In this sense, scientific interest is only a variant form of religious interest. Any survey of the scientific devotion to truth as an ideal will confirm this statement. There is, however, a grave divergence between science and religion in respect to the phases of individual experience with which they are concerned. Religion is centered upon the harmony of rational thought with the sensitive reaction to the percepta from which experience originates. Science is concerned with the harmony of rational thought with the percepta themselves. When science deals with emotions, the emotions in question are percepta and not immediate passions, other people's emotion and not our own, at least our own in recollection and not in immediacy. Religion deals with the formation of the experiencing subject, whereas science deals with the objects, which are the data forming the primary phase in this experience. The subject originates from and amid given conditions. Science conciliates thought with this primary matter of fact, and religion conciliates the thought involved in the process with the sensitive reaction involved in that same process. The process is nothing else than the experiencing subject itself. In this explanation, it is presumed that an experiencing subject is one occasion of sensitive reaction to an actual world. Science finds religious experiences among its percepta, and religion finds scientific concepts among the conceptual experiences to be fused with the particular sensitive reactions. The conclusion of this discussion is, first, the assertion of the old doctrine that breadth of thought reacting with intensity of sensitive experience stands out as an ultimate claim of existence. Secondly, the assertion that empirically the development of self-justifying thoughts has been achieved by the complex process of generalizing from particular topics, of imaginatively schematizing the generalizations, and finally, by renewed comparison of the imagined scheme with the direct experience to which it should apply. There is no justification for checking generalization at any particular stage. Each phase of generalization exhibits its own peculiar simplicities which stand out just at that stage and not at any other. There are simplicities connected with the motion of a bar of steel, which are obscured if we refuse to abstract from the individual molecules. And there are certain simplicities concerning the behavior of men, which are obscured if we refuse to abstract from the individual peculiarities of particular specimens. In the same way, there are certain general truths about the actual things in the common world of activity which will be obscured when attention is confined to some particular detailed mode of considering them. These general truths involved in the meaning of every particular notion respecting the actions of things are the subject matter for speculative philosophy. Philosophy destroys its usefulness when it indulges in brilliant feats of explaining away. It is then trespassing with the wrong equipment upon the field of particular sciences. Its ultimate appeal is to the general consciousness of what in practice we experience. Whatever thread of presupposition characterizes social expression throughout the various epochs of rational society must find its place in philosophic theory. Speculative boldness must be balanced by complete humility before logic and before fact. It is a disease of philosophy when it is neither bold nor humble, but merely a reflection of the temperamental presuppositions of exceptional personalities. Analogously, we do not trust any recasting of scientific theory depending upon a single performance of an aberrant experiment unrepeated. The ultimate test is always widespread, recurrent experience, and the more general the rationalistic scheme, the more important is this final appeal. The useful function of philosophy is to promote the most general systematization of civilized thought. There is a constant reaction between specialism and common sense. It is the part of the special sciences to modify common sense. Philosophy is the welding of imagination and common sense into a restraint upon specialists, and also into an enlargement of their imaginations. By providing the generic notions, philosophy should make it easier to conceive the infinite variety of specific instances which rest unrealized in the womb of nature. So as we continue here in section 6, I just want to highlight that some people criticize speculative philosophy for being overambitious. Rationalism is a method which advances inside the limits of a particular discipline. Now, some people believe that the success in these limited disciplines shouldn't lead us to attempt to make more ambitious schemes which express the general nature of everything. One supposed justification for discouraging people from carrying out speculative philosophy is supposedly that it does not work. European thought, is given as an example, is a wasteland of abandoned and unreconciled conflicting metaphysical systems, supposedly. This assertion applies the old dogmatic test of the logician, true, false, or meaningless. The same test would assess that the most respected physical sciences also have failed because ultimately our partial understanding results in us concluding our statements about the discipline are false. But this is not the case. In the same way that we don't retain the physics of 17th century, we also don't retain the Cartesian philosophy of that century, but within limits, both of these systems will still express something important, some important truth if they're defined in their proper limits. Now, we're beginning on our own time, as Whitehead continues on, to understand the wider categories which define the various disciplines and their limits for correct application. Mankind never quite knows what it's after. Throughout history, we've tried one idea after another, defining their limits, and we find its core of truth. As Augustine says, this is my take on the Latin, it's easy to judge the world, which holds true when we consider our instinctual ability to adventure intellectually at the very least, and men can do what they can to systematize and achieve something, or at least they try to. Now, the proper test, instead of the logician's test of whether or not a speculative philosophical system or any discipline is not that of finality, true, false, meaningless, but that of progress. If we made progress, then we are successful. But there are more objections. The main objection Whitehead perceives dates from the 16th century and culminates in Francis Bacon's belief that philosophical speculation is ultimately useless. The people who hold to this objection believe that we should describe reality and articulate laws arriving at principles which only apply to the systems from which they originate. In other words, general laws of physics ought to remain in the realm of physics and should not be further abstracted so as to apply some of the same principles, say, to biology, literature, or metaphysics. To people who are in agreement with Bacon, general systems of interpretation have no bearing upon this procedure, and so any metaphysical system remains intrinsically fruitless. Unfortunately, for those who hold to this opinion, there are no self-contained facts. And this is another one of those points where Whitehead kind of bridges between the conclusion and the premise of his next statement. So, unfortunately, for those who hold to this opinion, there are no self-contained facts, and facts are not capable of being understood apart from interpretation, because facts are elements experiencing reality in the system of the universe. Whenever we attempt to express our immediate experiences, our understanding of our immediate experience leads beyond the experience itself. Our understanding of our experience leads to contemporary experiences, to our past experiences, and to our future experiences. I should note here that this is the influence of Bergson's theory of time here on Whitehead. Our understanding of immediate experience leads to the universals which give our experience their definition. Now, these universals, by their characteristic of being universal, embody the potential for other experiences to exist with varying kinds of definition. So, understanding facts requires us to interpret facts in a metaphysical framework as an item in a world with some systematic relation to it. Now, when we think, we find interpretations readily available to us in the act of thinking. Philosophy does not initiate interpretations. Philosophy searches for a rationalistic scheme so that we can make an adequate criticism and justification of an interpretation of the world we employ when we think. If we want to have a sample of uninterpreted experience, we'll need to ask a rock to write down its autobiography. Every stab at scientific accounts is thoroughly interpretive. The method of rational interpretation, where we seek critical and justified interpretations, is the product of the fitful vagueness of consciousness, and what a mouthful that is. The fitful vagueness of consciousness we might define as elements which shine with immediate distinction to us in some situations and are shrouded in darkness in other situations. But all occasions of experience are actual within the flux of a solid, meaning real, world, which demands a unity of interpretation. Philosophy is a result of the human consciousness self-correcting from its own initial excess into subjectivity. In other words, we sense that we have gone too far in our subjective assessment and self-correct by seeking out a critical and justifiable scheme. Each actual occasion of experience contributes additional formative elements to its own peculiar individuality. Each occasion is involved in its own becoming, and in essence becomes something more than it was. Consciousness is the last and greatest element in this formative process. By means of consciousness, the individual occasion achieves this individuality by obscuring the external totality from which it originates and embodies. An actual occasion or individual like this is operating on a higher grade. Not a higher grade of reality, but a higher grade of experience. The occasion is a part of the totality by virtue of the principle of relativity. There are no self-contained things. Individuals exist in relation to the whole. However, this higher grade of individual has attained a depth of individuality by selectively emphasizing certain elements in the process of becoming, which suits its own purposes. Now, the task of philosophy is to recover the totality which is obscured by the selection of the individual organism. Philosophy replaces what has been obscured by higher evolved individuals by virtue of their sense experience and consciousness, as these processes have developed in a narrowing towards a particular purpose, not towards the task of seeing the world more broadly. So an individual's selective experience is moral insofar as it conforms to the balance of a hierarchy of values or importance as described in the rational scheme. Conversely, or oppositely, we might convert intellectual insight gained by the rational scheme into an emotional force for correcting our experiences towards morality, which is determined by our framework. Our corrections should be made in proportion to the rationality of the scheme. So then, morality is inseparably linked to generality, or a general metaphysical framework. We can only overcome the dichotomy between the greater good of all and the good of the individual when the individual's good is the same as the greater good. The individual can only find the good in the greater good by losing certain minor, intense, selective desires. The individual finds these desires again in the greater good, in a finer composition, and with a wider applicability. So a personal example of this for myself is that becoming more environmentally conscious has led to all sorts of life changes that were annoying at first, but then led into newer and more interesting ways of living for me. For instance, I found a shoe developer that creates all vegan shoes. I didn't know that existed before. This allows me to open up to new possibilities I didn't even know were a thing. And as I change my behavior patterns, that further widens the way for different ways of thinking. The individual good has become the greater good as the individual has become more ecologically minded. And that's all I have for today. I know it's kind of an intense section there, and I apologize if it was difficult to follow. This is not an easy work. I'm doing my best to rephrase these things in the best way as possible. Thanks for supporting the show. Don't forget to share and tell all your friends all that junk. Yeah, I'll see you next time. This is Process and Reality.